Good morning, welcome back. And no, I am not out on the deck this morning because primarily it is cold and windy. There's two reasons that I'm not on the deck. It's cold, it's windy, and there's snow out. Three reasons: cold, wind, snow. So instead, I am here in the Shea Ray living room in front of the Shea Ray Christmas tree. And if you look at that and think, man, that's beautiful, that's largely because I had nothing to do with it. I did bring it up here and set it up, but other than that, this is all the work of my lovely and talented gardener wife. So she did all of the Christmas tree stuff. But today we are back. It's been a month, and we're going to start talking today about the writer Luke and Acts, especially as we get into that discussion of those two New Testament works. But first, let's talk a little bit about what happened on this date, January 9th, in history. Well, it was on this date in 1493 that Christopher Columbus, sailing around the Dominican Republic, reported seeing three mermaids. Okay, reported seeing three mermaids. It was later figured out that what he had actually seen were three manatees. Now, here's a picture of a manatee. So I can only guess that Christopher Columbus's eyesight at this point in his life was not that good. But that was on this date in 1493. In 1839, the first photograph of a man was published. Here's a picture. Here's the picture itself. And if you look real carefully, you'll see down in the corner, there's a picture of a man getting his shoe shine. And that is the first picture of a human being, of a man, 1839. And ever since that time, every man has done this whenever a camera has come out. So, but that was on this date in 1839. In 1912, the U.S. government sent Marines to Honduras. Not quite an invasion, but pretty close. It wasn't really out of any great love for democracy or the people of Honduras, as much as it was protection for the banana companies that were down there. The United Fruit Company, the Cayamel Fruit Company. It's a really interesting story that I was able to read a few books about last summer in anticipation of a trip to Honduras. But, it's interesting, the whole banana universe and how it works. Did you know that bananas are not grown anywhere in the United States? It's just kind of one of those things that I find quite interesting. But for the number of bananas that we eat, none of them are grown in the U.S. It was on this date in 1989 that the Baseball Hall of Fame inducted both Carl Yastrzemski from the Boston Red Sox and Johnny Bench from the Cincinnati Reds. Both of these players, clearly two of the greatest players of all time. Two players that I have both personally saw play in their near the end of their career, of course. But I did see both Yastrzemski play and Johnny Bench. No controversy there. 2 years later, in 1991, in a slightly more controversial decision, the Baseball Hall of Fame banned Pete Rose banned him from baseball, so to speak, so that he cannot be voted into the Hall of Fame. This is one of their more controversial decisions, and one that I just want to go on record as saying I disagree with. So there, I said it. I think Pete Rose should be in the Baseball Hall of Fame. Speaking of disgraced people, today's birthdays include Richard Nixon, born on this date in 1913. Richard Nixon, U.S. President from 1969 to 1974 when he resigned, born on this date. Nixon is also well known for being one of the two presidents who has been on the ballot 5 times. The first president to be on the presidential ballot 5 times was Franklin Roosevelt, who ran for vice president in 1920, and then for president in 32, 36, 40, and 44. Richard Nixon ran for vice president in 52 and 56. Then he ran for president in 1960. Then he ran for president again in 1968 and in 1972. So Richard Nixon, Franklin Roosevelt. There's your trivia for the day. And finally, today in 1935, Bob Denver was born. Actor Bob Denver. Some of you may remember him from the TV show The Adventures of Dobie Gillis. And if not, perhaps you remember him from this role as Gilligan. So happy birthday to Bob Denver and to Richard Nixon. So, all right, let's begin our discussion now. I'm not going to do it in front of the Christmas tree, but we're going to begin our discussion of Luke and Acts. Good morning, welcome back. We are here today to begin our study of Luke, the writings of Luke, which incorporate the book of Luke, the Gospel of Luke, and the book of Acts. Okay, it's kind of a departure from talking about Isaiah for so long, but we'll see that there are certain aspects of Isaiah that play into Luke. Luke quotes Isaiah 61 and a few other passages, so that's something that's interesting to talk about. This is the introductory session, and so what that means is going to be a little bit more disjointed in that there's a lot of topics that may or may not relate, but as we go through the book, they'll become a little clearer. So when we start to talk about Luke, the writings of Luke, and which include the book of Luke and the Gospel of Acts, what many people don't realize is that Luke is actually the largest contributor to the New Testament. If you were to ask people, typical, churchgoers in 2022, who wrote more of the New Testament than anyone else, a typical answer would be, oh, well, Paul did, because Paul wrote 12 or 13 books, depending on how you consider authorship. Okay, and Luke only wrote 2. But if you start adding up verses in and number of verses and number of words, Luke actually wrote more of the New Testament than anyone else. Okay, and so that's one good reason to copy Luke. Another reason to deal with Luke is because, I've done Mark and I've done John, and I prepared actually several years ago, probably a decade ago, I prepared a whole session. I was going to do Luke, and just for whatever reason wasn't able to pull it off, and so I've been ready for this for a decade. So I'm just saying I've been ready for a decade to talk about this. So Luke. So what do we know about Luke? Let's start talking about him. And again, this is I'm talking about the third gospel: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and the book of Acts. Okay. One of the things that we learn or we know right away as we talk about Luke is that Luke and Acts. Let's talk about the author. Again, let me start there. Let's talk about the author. Okay. Well, Luke. And how do we know that? Well, first of all, we look at the introduction to Luke and we look at the introduction to Acts. Okay, and I'm going to read those two passages here for you real quick. Okay, first of all, Luke chapter 1, beginning with verse 1. By the way, for this particular study, I am back to using the NIV, the updated NIV, and this is, the NIV is my preferred text. So here we go. So Luke chapter 1, beginning with verse 1, the first 4 verses. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. Okay. Now let's compare that to the first 2 verses of the book of Acts. In my former book, Theophilus, I wrote about all that Jesus began to do and teach until the day he was taken up to heaven, after giving instructions through the Holy Spirit to the apostles he had chosen. Okay, so if you compare those two, it seems pretty clear, that the same person wrote the Gospel of Luke that wrote the book of Acts. Okay, so Acts says, in my former book, and it's addressed to Theophilus, and we'll talk about Theophilus in a minute. In my former book, and it's very clearly referring to a book talking about the life, death, burial, resurrection of Jesus. Okay, so it's pretty clear that Luke and Acts are written by the same person. Okay, so not too many people disagree with that particular point. Okay, so Luke and Acts are written by the same person. Okay, now let's look at Acts chapter 16. Now, I'm going to read a passage. And after I read the passage, you just think about what you hear, and I'm going to ask you about it, okay? So in Acts chapter 16, okay, now this is just after the Council of Jerusalem. Paul and Silas are traveling, and beginning in verse 6, okay? Paul and his companions traveled throughout the region of Phrygia and Galatia, having been kept by the Holy Spirit from preaching the word in the province of Asia. When they came to the border of Mysia, they tried to enter Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus would not allow them to. So they passed by Mysia and went down to Troas. During the night, Paul had a vision of a man of Macedonia standing and begging him, come over to Macedonia and help us. After Paul had seen the vision, we got ready at once to leave for Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. Okay, now, what changed? What happened in that particular passage? Okay, what happened? Okay, let me go back. Paul and his companions, this is verse 6, Paul and his companions traveled throughout the region, etc., etc. Okay, verse 8, so they passed by Mysia and went down to Troas. Okay, so they pass by, they come to Troas. Okay, this is just the narrative. The writer is saying this. Then, during the night, Paul had a vision of a man of Macedonia standing and begging him, come over to Macedonia and help us. So Paul has this vision of going to Macedonia. Now look at what happens here in verse 10. After Paul had seen the vision, we got ready. What happened? Whoever is writing this story joins the story at this point. Okay? So previously in verses 6 through 8, it's they did this, they did this, they did this. Then beginning with verse 10, it's we did this, we did this, we did this. So whoever is writing the book of Acts, okay, and the writer of the book of Acts is the same as the writer of the book of Luke, whoever is writing Acts joins Paul at this point. Okay, and then through the rest of the book of Acts, we see a lot of this. We did this. We did this. We did this. Okay, so what we can conclude from that is that whoever wrote Acts was a companion of Paul. Okay, and whoever wrote Luke wrote Acts. So whoever wrote Luke is a companion of Paul as well. Okay, so how do we know it's Luke? Well, we don't. Okay, we don't. There's no official byline. There's no registry in the Copyright Office or anything like that. We do know from several passages in Paul's epistles that Luke was a companion of Paul's. In Colossians chapter 4, Paul names Luke as our dear friend Luke the doctor. Okay, so if you've ever heard reference to Luke being a doctor or Luke being a physician, this is where it comes from in Colossians 4:14. Our dear friend Luke the doctor. In Philemon, verse 24, talks about Luke, our fellow worker. Okay, he refers to Luke as his fellow worker. And then in 2 Timothy, which is generally considered to be near the end of Paul's life, he says, only Luke is with me. Okay, so what we know is that one of the last, what we can derive from that is that one of the last companions, somebody who stayed with Paul till the very end, was Luke. Okay, we know that Luke was a doctor. Okay, Luke is a Greek name. We kind of draw the conclusion that Luke may have been Greek, but let me hold that thought for a second. So we know that Luke was with Paul. Okay, so somewhere in the first 20 or 30 years after this book was published, it was well known, it was fairly well believed that Luke was the author of both the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. Okay, and there's been little discussion about that ever since. Okay, this is not one where there's a lot of discussion, a lot of argument, a lot of disagreement. Okay, pretty much everybody is comfortable with saying, yes, Luke wrote both Acts and the Gospel of Luke. Okay, only Luke is with me. So there's a fairly strong tradition. And there's some other points about it. If Luke was in fact a physician, which Paul seems to indicate, that suggests even in this time that Luke would have been a very educated man. And the Greek, as I understand it, again, I've taken Greek, I've studied Greek. I'm by no means a Greek scholar, but as I understand it, the Greek, as is written by the author of Luke and Acts, is fairly polished, is fairly high level, which suggests that the writer was educated. Okay, so you have a companion of Paul, educated, somebody who had the opportunity to investigate all of this stuff. Okay, and so again, tradition says it was Luke. Okay, so we're going to hold that thought because we're going to come back to it in a little bit, in a few minutes, as far as we get into talking about the point of the book. So when was it written? When was the book of written? When was the book of Luke written? Well, what we know is that Jesus' life takes place from about 3 or 4 BC, before the Common Era, before Christ, to about 30 AD, okay, or Common Era, okay. So then from 30 to 60, so the next 10 or 20 years, and we know this from going through the rest of the New Testament passages, is it was pretty well believed that Jesus' return was going to be imminent, or that it was imminent, okay, that any minute now. And then suddenly, after about 20 or 30 years, people started realizing, hey, wait a minute, this isn't going to happen, okay? And people started writing down their reminiscences about the life of Jesus and what he had done and what he had said and all that kind of stuff, okay? So most people look at this, and again, remember we talked about, or the first verse of Luke chapter 1, many have undertaken to draw up an account, okay? So we're far enough separated from the life, death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus that many have undertaken to write up an account of Jesus' life, okay? So most people look at this as saying, okay, probably in the 80s, somewhere, 60 to 70, probably closer to 70, okay? Why does that matter? Or how do we, let me rephrase that, how do we come to that? How do we come to that idea? Well, one idea is that Paul dies in the mid-60s. Okay, that's pretty much established based on the epistles and that kind of stuff. And maybe we'll talk about that when we get to the book of Acts, how we know when Paul died. But tradition kind of tells us that Paul died, and Luke doesn't say anything about that. Okay, the writer of Acts, the writer of Luke, doesn't say anything about Paul's death. So the assumption is that it was written prior to Paul's death. Okay, which would have been the late 60s. Okay, so another thing is in AD 70, we know that the Romans invaded Israel, and destroyed Jerusalem. And there's no reference to that destruction of Jerusalem. Okay, so people look at that destruction of Jerusalem and say, because nothing is said about that, it had to be beforehand, because you would not talk about it. You couldn't talk about Jerusalem after AD 70 without mentioning the fact that Jerusalem had been destroyed. Let me rephrase that. Let me illustrate how that works. Suppose I were to write something or say something, or give you a piece of writing, a sentence, and the sentence says, the White Sox, the Chicago White Sox, Chicago's American League Baseball team, plays its games at Comiskey Park. Okay? Chicago White Sox plays its baseball games at Comiskey Park. Now, if you know anything about the Chicago area, you automatically know that you wouldn't write that today, because the Chicago White Sox do not play their games at Comiskey Park anymore. Okay? In fact, they haven't played their games at Comiskey Park since at the most recent 2003. Okay? Now, if you're a real particular person, you would say the Chicago White Sox haven't played at Comiskey Park since 1990, okay? Because there was Comiskey Park, and I'm going to try and put a picture in here of Comiskey Park, the original Comiskey Park, and there was the original Comiskey Park, and then after 1990, there was the new Comiskey Park, okay? They tore it down on one side of the street and built up a new Comiskey Park on the other side of the street. Okay, so there was the new Comiskey Park. So from 1990 to about 2003, it was called New Comiskey Park, okay, or the New Comiskey across the street. And then in 2003, it was changed to Bank Cellular Field, U.S. Cellular Field, and now they call it Guaranteed Rate Field. Okay, so what I mean by that is to say, look, if I were to give you a piece of writing and say, when was this written, and it says the Chicago White Sox plays their home games at Comiskey Park, you could look at that and, based on your knowledge of history, say, oh, well, it had to be written before 1990 or before 2003, depending on how particular you want to get. Okay, so just like the same idea that when you write about Jerusalem and you don't talk about the destruction, you must assume that the destruction is still existent. So or not that the destruction, that the city still exists. Okay, so that's one of the markers that is used to show that this had to be written before that time period. Okay, So mid-60s. Okay. So that's kind of one how we put the date. Okay. Now, as we look at the book, we look at both Acts and Luke. One of the things they have in common is they're both addressed to someone named Theophilus. Okay, Theophilus. Here in verse, let's see, what is it? Verse 3. I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. Okay, who is this guy? Okay, who is Theophilus? Okay, well, here's the bottom line. We don't know. Okay, we don't know. Okay, you basically have two choices. Okay, either one, Theophilus, whose the name itself means friend of God. Theo and Philos, like, Philadelphia, city of brotherly love, Theo, theology, study of God. Okay, Theo, Philos, okay, friend of God, or lover of God. So, Theophilus is the addressee. Now, your one idea is that Theophilus is like a patron, okay? And a patron would be somebody who kind of paid money or bankrolled, throughout the first 1500 years that artists had patrons, that an artist couldn't just like paint a picture and assume that he or she was going to be able to sell it on the open market for millions and millions of dollars. So he or she would have a patron, and the patron would pay them their living whatever, and they would produce artwork for them. So like people like Michelangelo and all these guys, they all had patrons, okay, that did this. And so some have argued that Theophilus is a patron. He's a rich. Theophilus is Greek, so it's a rich Greek person, Gentile, Greek being also Gentile, who Luke is writing for. That maybe he's paying Luke to put this all together. Doesn't really sound like it. But that's one idea, okay? And if you want to stick with that, that's great. Another idea, and this is generally more commonly held, is that Theophilus is just sort of a stand-in for an individual. So, for example, if I was going to write a story about the Chicago White Sox, I could dedicate it to the baseball fan out there who remembers baseball at Comiskey Park, okay? Now, the language, the wording used indicates it's to an individual, that there's one baseball fan who remembers, yet anybody who reads that will know that refers to a larger audience. Okay? And this is generally what people think when they look at the word Theophilus, that they think this is a book written to the God friends, the friends of God, the God lovers, people of God who want a systematic approach to the life of Jesus, and we'll talk about that systematic approach in a second. Okay, and I think that's probably what it is. Okay, that there isn't necessarily an individual named Theophilus, although again, I don't have perfect knowledge of this. There could be, probably not, but again, if you want to stick to that, that's great. Okay, it's probably just a name used to stand in for the friends of God, the God-fearers, and we'll talk about that as we go through the book, what a God-fearer is. Okay, so Luke is writing this book, is addressing it to these particular persons. Okay, now what is the book? Let's talk a little bit about just Luke itself, because Acts is a little bit different. Okay, what is Luke? Okay, Luke is one of the four Gospels. Okay, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Okay. It is the third gospel. It's the third gospel only because that's the way Jerome put them in order. Okay, it could very well have been Luke, Mark, John, or whatever. Matthew could have been any four. Okay, there's nothing inherently inspirational, meaning inspired by God, in that Luke comes after Mark and before John. Okay, the order is completely arbitrary, more or less. Completely arbitrary. Okay, so don't draw any conclusions about that. Okay, having said that, what is a gospel? Now, gospel is a word that is annoyingly flexible and fluid and has a lot of different meanings depending on who you ask. So if you say, and I'm not going to settle it here, but if you put four different spiritual or religious leaders, 4 different preachers from 4 different traditions, and you put a Methodist, and you put a Catholic, and you put a Baptist, and you put I don't know what's left here, an Anglican over there, and you say, what is the gospel? What does the word gospel mean? You're probably going to get 4 different answers. Okay? For some people, the gospel, when you talk about the gospel is just the story of Jesus Christ that draws men to salvation, men and women to salvation. And there's truth to all of these. Okay? That's the thing to remember. There's truth to all of these. Okay? It's just the story of Jesus that draws men and women to salvation. Okay? And that's great. Okay? And that's the gospel to that particular group. Okay. To others, when they talk about the gospel is salvation. Certainly it's salvation. It always starts with the idea of salvation, the story of Jesus that leads people to salvation. But it also implies taking up service, taking up your cross, okay, and following Jesus and doing what Jesus did, okay. And that there's a life of service, that the gospel, that if you have accepted the gospel, it accepts this life of service, okay. And there are people that say that that's what the gospel is. Okay, and there have been books and arguments and things about that. I mean, one of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's books, The Cost of Discipleship, is arguing against the idea that the gospel is only about salvation, but that it also implies a life of service. Okay, when God calls a man, he calls him to come and die. Okay, it's a paraphrase of what Bonhoeffer says, okay? But to other people, when they look at the word gospel, they see a much broader implication in terms of what you're supposed to do. When they see the gospel, they say, when you take up the gospel, when you accept the gospel, you take up a mandate of God to liberate, to free the oppressed. Okay, so if you are in South America and you are a liberation theologian, or if you are somebody who is very in tune with Walter Rauschenbusch and the theology of the social gospel, you would look at the gospel and you would say, oh yeah, if you accept the gospel, it means you have to go out there and fight the oppressor. And these are all great, and there are good people who take any one of these 3 things, and there's elements of truth in all 3 of them, and there are elements of probably error in all 3 of them, and I am not going to settle this here. Okay? So, having said that, there's another phrase of the gospel. Now, the word itself, gospel, originally just meant good news. Okay? In fact, there are some that have talked about the 4 gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, as the 4 evangelists. Okay, because evangelism, good news, that's the word that gets translated gospel in the Greek. Okay, and in the pre-New Testament times, and that is like just in the Roman Empire, a gospel was just kind of a good news announcement of a military victory. Okay, so the Roman army would be out there fighting somebody, or the Greek army or whatever would be out there fighting somebody, and they would win a great victory, and they would send somebody to make the gospel, to give the gospel, give the good news of this military victory, okay? And so the New Testament writers kind of took that phrase, and it's used throughout the New Testament, and Paul uses it and all that. If anybody preaches any other gospel than what I preach, Paul says. So again, it's a word that gets used a lot. But we come to these 4 books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and we call them 4 gospels, okay? So a gospel in that sense, in that definition, a gospel is a story. It's a narrative story. It's a narrative story with a purpose. Okay, it's not history. It's historical narrative with a specific purpose. Okay, so it starts with being a historical narrative, and interestingly enough, Luke is in fact generally considered to be a classical historian. Okay, for example, I've got this book. I've had this for quite some time. It's a book by Michael Grant called Readings in the Classical Historians. Okay, and if you turn to page 395, you see a chapter called St. Luke and the Acts of the Apostles. So amongst the classical historians, Luke is considered one of them, along the lines of a Josephus. Okay, and I think part of that is because of just what Luke says here in terms of what he does, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But a gospel in that sense, when we talk about the book or the Gospel of Mark, we talk about the Gospel of Luke, it's a historical narrative. It takes a story of a person's life, and of course in this case it's the life of Jesus, and we this story is chosen, and facts and events and teachings are chosen to make a specific point. Okay, to say something about that person. It isn't history in the sense that we like to think of it today. Okay, and what I mean by that, here we are in 2022, and if you start talking about somebody's writing history, we have this mistaken, okay, just hold that thought, mistaken idea that when a person sits down and writes a history, he or she is writing the definitive story, and that's not true. Okay, historians have never been objective. Okay, never. Okay. Historians have always chosen their facts, their subjects, their topics, their order, their presentation to fulfill some bigger picture of what they think the big picture is. Okay, and I know right now there's a lot of people who are complaining about people rewriting history. Okay, this is something that you hear a lot about. Okay, oh, so-and-so, that person is just rewriting history. Let me tell you something. Okay, again, I have two degrees in history major, done a lot of history. Rewriting history is what historians do. That's their job. You know, there are like every year dozens of new biographies of Abraham Lincoln are written. Okay, hundreds of them. There are hundreds of biographies of Abraham Lincoln, and every time somebody pulls out and says, I'm going to write a biography of Abraham Lincoln, he or she is sitting down and saying, those other guys missed something. Because you really think about it, if everything that has been written about Abraham Lincoln has been said, then there'd be no reason to write another one, right? But yet, here they go. Why? Because they're rewriting history, because that's what historians do. Okay? So, you know, again, it's kind of, and again, this is a side note, but it just sort of annoys me when you've got people that are hear about something and say, oh, well, he or she is just rewriting history, as if that settles the argument. It doesn't. Okay, it doesn't. It's just like looking at somebody mowing their lawn and going, oh, well, he's just mowing the lawn. Well, yeah, of course he's mowing. That's what he does. Okay, but that's what she does. Historians rewrite history. That's what they do. Okay, I'm sorry, I digress. Let me get back to talking about Luke. Okay, so Luke has looked at these particular passages. He's looked at these particular narratives, and again, we'll get into, and he's picking his subjects. He's picking the events. He's picking the topics based on what he can certify. Okay, because remember, at the end, so that you may know the certainty of the things that you have taught. So Luke is using his resources. He's checking, and now again, we know he's in contact with Paul, but if he's in contact with Paul, chances are he's in contact with a few other of the apostles, and he's going, tell me how you remember this story. Tell me how you remember this event. Tell me what you remember about this example. Okay? And he's writing out, and he's saying, this is what I can certify. Okay? Now, let me take this into another point, okay? And that is talking about synoptics. Okay, I want to talk about synoptics for a minute. Okay, I'm going to make a note here because this is not where I meant to, so I'm going to have to change my handout when I do this live. When we talk about synoptics, there's 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Okay, so Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the synoptic Gospels. So S-Y-N, syn, together, like synthesis, kind of, things together. Optic, viewing, eyes, the optics are good. Okay, so they are seen together. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke are 3 Gospels that kind of tell the story with a very similar structure. John is its own thing. Okay, John goes a completely different direction than everyone else. Okay, and so in the Synoptic Gospels, you have all of these different stories. Several of them are similar. Several of them are very close. Several of them are somewhat different, and there's a big discussion. And so what happens is in looking at the Gospels, there's a great parlor game to kind of sit there and say, okay, well, is Mark borrowing from Luke, or is Luke borrowing from Mark, or is Matthew writing off of both of them, or how does this work? And this is all great fun. to do. And it's as much fun as looking at Shakespeare's plays and going, okay, where did Shakespeare get this idea from? Or where did Shakespeare get that idea from? Okay. But the fact is, each of these gospel writers wrote a book to make their particular point. Okay. And I want to introduce, there is something, and this comparison of these three, as far as which came first and all this, is what typically is referred to as the synoptic problem. Okay. In textual criticism, higher criticism, things like that, people talk about the synoptic problem. Okay. I want to suggest another synoptic problem. And the other synoptic problem is this, and that is that we look at a particular gospel story, we look at a particular narrative, and then we feel that we have to include the details from the other gospel narrative in order to complete what this writer failed to complete. Okay? That to me is a problem. Okay? Now, Luke is not arguing that this is the definitive life of Jesus. This is what he was able to verify. Let me illustrate. I can absolutely, and I will swear on a stack of Bibles, that Carl Yastrzemski played one time at Comiskey Park. Okay? One time at Comiskey Park. I know because I was there. Okay? It was his final season. I went to see him. Went to see the game. White Sox were playing about Boston Red Sox. And when he came up to bat, they played a song by Elton John that was very popular at the time called I'm Still Standing, because, it was his last season. I believe he was like 42 or 43 years old. He was still playing. Okay? So I can certify that Carl Yastrzemski played one game at Comiskey. Okay? Now, is that the definitive answer in terms of how many games Carl Yastrzemski played at Comiskey Park? No, clearly he's not. He played for 40 years, he played for 20 years, 20 plus years for the Boston Red Sox. He played a bunch of games at Comiskey Park. I personally can only verify one. That doesn't mean just the fact that I say there's one means that there weren't 100 others. Because you figured, I don't know how many, 20 years, 5 games, maybe there were 100 others. Okay? So it's only what I can verify. Okay? So Luke is only giving us what we can verify, what he can verify. And that's great. And that shows the message that he's going to try to produce. Okay? That shows us the message that he wants to give. And this is important, especially as we get into looking at these things. And because there's just this tendency, and again, it's very hard not to do because we're so familiar with it, to say, well, Luke says this, and Mark says this, and Matthew says this. Okay? I heard an ad around Christmas time on the radio. I don't know which station, Moody or one of the other stations, about somebody had created what essentially is the harmony of the gospel. Okay, so they took the four gospel stories, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and they put them together in such a way that it reads as a single narrative, and they're calling it the perfect story. Okay, and I remember one of the things that I found interesting is that it included notes by John MacArthur, as if that's the be all and end all. But be that as it may, and they were calling it this. Put these four. It's the perfect story. And I remember I'm driving in the car and I'm listening to this and going, no. We have got to resist the urge to think that we have to create the perfect story. Okay? The perfect story is that there are four stories: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Each one of them has an individual. Now you can draw conclusions from all four. Okay? You can do that, just like you can draw conclusions from all of the different biographies. You can, I can't think of. I know Dumas Malone and John Meacham both wrote biographies of Thomas Jefferson. You can compare those two and say, look, here he says this, here's a conclusion you can draw from that. Okay? And it bears the same weight. Okay? It's not the perfect story. The perfect story is that there are four individual stories. So I said all that to say this. As we're looking at this book, Luke, and then going into talking about Acts, I'm going to try as best as I can to focus on what Luke is saying and why Luke is saying it, without bringing in, well, we know from Matthew that this is going on at the same time, so we have to take that into account. Because we don't know that Luke's readers knew that. Okay, all we know is what Luke has given us. Okay, so that's kind of the point that I want to make in terms of the different things. And it gets really interesting, especially when you talk about, and we'll talk about this next week when we talk about the Christmas stories. Okay, did you know that the Christmas stories come, and I'm going to spill the beans here, the Christmas stories come from Matthew and they come from Luke. And there's little to no overlap between the two Christmas stories. Say, Mark and John don't talk about the birth of Jesus at all, whereas Matthew does and Luke does. But the story that Matthew tells, very little overlap with the story that Luke tells. And the story that Luke tells, very little overlap with Matthew. It's kind of an interesting question. But we're going to talk about what Luke has to say when we get there. So Luke and Acts. Now, what is Luke about? And as we get into talking about this Gospel of Luke, how is Luke structured, okay? Well, overall, the book itself has 4 or 5 sections. And these are arbitrary in that, there isn't, anytime, we try to put an outline on the book, it's arbitrary because, the book didn't come with an outline. Okay, so first of all, we talk about the introduction. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about that today. Okay, so I have a few minutes left. Then we're going to have the childhood narrative. Okay, that's the first 2 or 3 chapters. Okay, that is what we have just heard. We're in January. We heard several things about shepherds and all of that, and mangers and no room at the inn and all that. So we're going to talk about that when we talk about the childhood narrative stories. Okay, then the third part is we have Jesus in Galilee. Okay, Jesus in that northern part of Israel, around his hometown. Okay, he was born in Bethlehem, which was around Jerusalem, but he lived most of his life in and around Nazareth and Capernaum, which is up around the Sea of Galilee, up on the northern side of Israel. Okay, the fourth part of the book is talking about Jesus' route from Nazareth down to Jerusalem. Okay, towards his death. Okay, and this is in Luke, this is where most of the teaching comes in, parables and all that kind of stuff. The Sermon on the Plain, that sort of thing. Okay, most of that comes in that particular Jesus' route to route to Jerusalem. And then the fifth and final part of the book is the Passion Week, the last week of Jesus, and that's the last 4 chapters, I guess it's the last 5, chapters 20 through 24. Okay, that's the last portion, and we're going to kind of go through that. And I don't think it's going to take as long to get through through Luke, as it did Isaiah, because we're all very familiar with the stories. Okay, so we can kind of go through them and kind of look at what it is that Luke is trying to tell us about the life, death, burial, resurrection of Jesus. Okay, and how it matters and how we can be certain of it, because knowing the certainty, and I think that's going to be the theme I'm going to use for Acts. Knowing the certainty is what Luke is all about. So, in conclusion, let me go back to Luke chapter 1. And let's look at the first 4 verses. Let me find my... And there are 4 things we know. We can learn right away from the book of Luke, about the book of Luke, from these first 4 verses. Okay, let me reread these verses. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. Okay? So what do we know? What can we immediately learn from these first 4 verses? Well, number 1, Luke is not the first account. Okay, this is not the first one out of the door. Okay, he doesn't have first mover advantage, as they say in the business world. Okay, most scholars believe that Mark was first, but Luke says there's others. There's other accounts. Okay, maybe Mark, maybe Matthew. So I mean, I'm like a Mark, Matthew, Luke, John order kind of guy. Others are completely different, and that's fine. Okay, but many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled or believed. Okay, so not the first account. Secondly, the second thing we can learn is that there is clearly an oral tradition of the stories of the life of Jesus. Okay, so number one, not the first account. Secondly, there is an oral tradition, things handed down. Okay, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Okay, so number one, not the first account. Secondly, oral tradition. Third, Luke is not an eyewitness. Okay, so Luke says there's been a lot of people writing. It's been handed down from the eyewitnesses to us. Okay, when Luke says us from the eyewitnesses, he's clearly not an eyewitness. And this is where Luke gets his chops, so to speak, as being a historian. Okay, he's saying, I didn't witness this, just like when John Meacham writes a biography of Thomas Jefferson, he never met the guy. Okay, Thomas Jefferson died 150 years before John Meacham was born. Okay, although I personally have met John Meacham at a book review or book signing about a Thomas Jefferson. That's a side note. But be that as it may. Okay, so Luke is not an eyewitness. And Luke's goal here, Luke's goal, the fourth thing, is to verify or to certify. Okay, so I too decided, so there's all of these different accounts. Maybe there's Mark's account out there. Maybe there's Luke's account out there. I'm sorry. Maybe there's Matthew's account out there. Maybe there's the so-called Q document. Okay. Maybe there's some others that we just have lost to history. And so Luke says, listen, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to go through all of these different accounts. I'm going to compare them. I'm going to talk to Paul. I'm going to talk to Peter. I'm going to talk to the apostles I know, the eyewitnesses I know, the people I'm around, and I'm going to say, what do you remember about this? What are you going to remember about this? And the end goal is that I am going to, so that you, God-fearers, will know the certainty that I'm going to just I'm going to separate the wheat from the chaff. I'm going to get down to the bottom line and say, this is what we know about Jesus, and this is why it matters. Okay? So, that's the interesting, or that's the introduction. Okay, and that's the introduction to Luke and Acts. Again, we're going to kind of have another sort of session like this as we get to Acts, because there's some changes that come about with Acts. But we're going to talk about Luke, and Luke is going to start picking up the narrative, and we're going to pick it up next week as we start talking about the Christmas story. We're going to talk about John the Baptist, and then we're going to talk about Elizabeth, and we're going to talk about Mary, and hopefully we're going to get through all of that in one session. So thank you for coming back. Thank you for being a part of this today. If you have any questions, by all means, send me an email, stan_rea@yahoo.com, or leave a note on the Facebook page, leave a note on the YouTube channel if you have any questions or anything, and we'll talk about it then. All right. Well, thank you very much. And assuming the weather gets better, I'll talk to you. Well, again, regardless of the weather, I still hope the weather gets better. Hope you all are doing well health-wise, and we'll see you again next week.